Welcome to Historical Sleep Stories. Wherever you are tonight, let this be the moment you set the day down. There is nothing left to carry now, nothing left to solve. Let your shoulders soften and let your eyes rest, even if they are not yet closed. Tonight, we're going somewhere far away and long ago. If you'd like, let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always lovely to picture you all, tucked in and drifting off together. We travel back to Georgian, England, to a night in the 1780s, aboard the last mail coach to the Cotswolds. And now, let's begin. The railways were spreading now, quietly, mile by mile, across the country. Within a few months, some said, this very coach route would fade gently into history, replaced by something faster and less patient. But on this particular evening, none of that mattered yet. The old rhythm still held, unhurried and certain, exactly as it had for generations. The coaching yard at the Swan Inn breathed with the business of early evening, ostlers moving between the stalls with the practiced ease of men who had harnessed 1,000 teams before this one, the horses stamping and shifting in their traces, their breath rising pale in the cooling October air. A lantern hung from an iron bracket above the yard door, its flame steady behind smoked glass, casting a warm circle of gold across the cobblestones below. Somewhere beyond the yard wall, a bell tolled the hour from a church tower, the sound arriving soft and rounded through the cooling air, and a dog barked once in answer before settling again into silence. The smell of the yard was its own quiet mixture, horse and leather, wood smoke drifting from the inn's chimney, the faint green tang of hay stacked near the stable door, and beneath it all, the cold, mineral smell of autumn itself settling over the town as the light continued its slow retreat toward dusk. Aldous Farrow stood near the mounting step, his greatcoat buttoned against the evening chill, watching the last of the luggage being lifted onto the coach's roof. Beside him, Prudence adjusted her gloves, finger by finger, her bonnet ribbons stirring faintly in the breeze that moved down the yard from the street beyond. 32 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, watching the horses. It hardly seems possible. Aldous said nothing, only reached for her hand and held it a moment longer than the step required, before helping her up into the coach. A boy ran past with a bucket for the horses, his boots loud against the stones, and somewhere near the stable, a groom whistled a low, tuneless song to himself as he worked, the sound blending easily into the yard's general hum. Above it all, the first stars had begun to appear in the darkening blue, faint and few, waiting patiently for the sky to fully surrender the last of the daylight. The innkeeper himself came out briefly to see the coach properly away, exchanging a final word with the coachman about the state of the roads beyond the first toll gate, his apron still dusted with the flour of some earlier kitchen task, his manner slow despite the yard's general bustle around him. The last of the daylight caught briefly on the coach's brass fittings before fading entirely, and somewhere above the inn's chimney, a thin line of smoke rose straight into the still evening air, undisturbed by any wind, marking the particular calm of a night that promised, so far, nothing but easy travelling ahead. While the ostlers finished with the last trunk, Prudence busied herself with her small travelling case, checking its contents with the quiet thoroughness of a woman who had packed for many journeys and trusted none of them to memory alone. Handkerchiefs, a shawl folded twice, her writing case, should she wish to send word ahead to their daughter. And beneath all of it, wrapped carefully in a twist of paper, a small sprig of dried lavender, its colour faded now to the palest violet grey, its scent still faintly present if one leaned close enough to notice. She had cut it years ago from the bouquet Aldous had given her the week after they first met, the first flowers any man had ever given her, and had kept a single sprig pressed and dried ever since, moved from one keepsake box to another as the decades passed. Never once mentioned to him. The paper it was wrapped in had grown soft and thin with handling, folded and unfolded so many times over the years that its creases had worn nearly to the point of tearing, and still she had never once thought to replace it with anything newer. She tucked it back beneath the handkerchiefs, closed the case, and handed it up to the waiting groom without a word, her expression giving away nothing at all. Aldous, watching from a few feet away, saw only that she smiled faintly to herself as she did it, and wondered, briefly and without any real suspicion, what small private thought had caused it. Outside the case, tucked into her reticule, where her fingers could find it easily, she carried a small vial of lavender water besides, a habit she had kept since girlhood, dabbed lightly at the wrists before any journey of consequence. She did not examine too closely why this certain journey seemed, to her own private reckoning, to deserve rather more care in the preparing than most. A final trunk was hoisted onto the roof above with a soft, muffled thud, and the ropes securing it were tested twice by careful hands before the ostler pronounced the load properly settled, satisfied that nothing would shift loose across the many miles ahead. The ostler called up a final confirmation of the count to the coachman above, and receiving a satisfied nod in return, stepped back from the coach fully, his part in the evening's preparations now properly finished. The coach's interior smelled of leather and old varnish, the mingled scent of a vehicle that had carried 1,000 passengers through 1,000 nights and retained something of each one. The seats were upholstered in dark green leather, cracked now at the seams from years of use, soft and yielding beneath the weight of a traveller settling in. Above the windows, a row of small brass fittings held the leather straps passengers used to steady themselves against the coach's motion, each one polished smooth by countless gloved hands, and along the floor a thin strip of worn carpet did little to soften the boards beneath, but seemed, all the same, a considered kindness on someone's part, long ago, toward the comfort of strangers. Aldous climbed up after Prudence and took the seat beside her, his knees nearly touching the opposite bench in the narrow space. He removed his hat and set it on his lap, running one hand once through his greying hair before resting back against the seat with a small, contented exhale. The coach creaked gently beneath them as another passenger climbed aboard, a young clergyman by his collar, murmuring a polite greeting as he took the forward-facing seat opposite. Prudence returned the greeting warmly. Aldous merely nodded, his attention already drifting toward the window, toward the lantern light still glowing in the yard, toward the evening that was, at last, properly beginning. A basket of provisions had been stowed beneath the forward seat, bread, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, a small stone bottle that would, by the smell of it, hold something warming for the colder hours ahead. Prudence noted it with quiet approval, the particular satisfaction of a traveller who had learned, over many journeys, to value such small foresight. A small oil lamp hung fixed near the coach's forward wall, its flame trimmed low but steady, casting just enough light to make out faces in the gathering dusk without overwhelming the softer glow still filtering in through the windows from the yard beyond. The coach door closed behind the last passenger with a solid, satisfying click, and for a moment the interior held itself in a hush. 4 strangers and a married pair of 32 years, all waiting together for the journey properly to begin. The coachman's whistle sounded once, sharp and clear above the yard's ordinary noise, and the horses leaned into their harness with a great collective shudder that travelled up through the coach's frame and into the wooden bench beneath them. The wheels turned, slow at first, grinding against the cobblestones, then finding their rhythm as the coach swung out through the yard gates and into the street beyond. Oxford passed the window in its evening dress, lamplighters moving from post to post with their long poles, shop fronts closing for the night, the occasional carriage rattling past in the opposite direction, its own lanterns swinging with the same steady motion theirs now kept. A group of scholars in dark gowns hurried along one pavement, their voices carrying briefly through the glass before the coach outpaced them, and somewhere a church bell struck the hour, joined a moment later by another, and then a third, the whole city seeming to mark the evening's arrival in careful, overlapping succession. The city's noise, so constant and enveloping by day, began to thin as the streets widened and the houses grew more spaced, until at last the coach passed beneath the final row of gas lamps and out toward the open road. Prudence watched it all pass with quiet attention, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and Aldous watched her watching it, and neither of them spoke, content for now simply to be moving. A watchman called the hour from a corner as they passed, his lantern swinging in one hand, his voice carrying the flat cadence of a man who had called the same hour on the same corner more nights than he could easily count. Prudence caught his eye for a brief moment through the glass, and he touched his hat to her, a small courtesy exchanged between strangers who would never meet again. A cart laden with barrels rumbled past in the opposite direction, its driver calling some good-natured complaint about the narrowness of the street, and the coachman answered in kind, the whole brief exchange carrying the particular easy familiarity of men who shared the same roads night after night and had long since run out of patience for standing on ceremony with one another. The last shop front they passed belonged to a chandler, its window still lit, a young apprentice visible within, sweeping the day's shavings into a neat pile near the door, entirely absorbed in the small closing rituals of his trade. Inside the coach, the last of the street lamps slid past the window and gave way to the deeper dark of the open road, and for a while no one spoke, each passenger settling into the particular quiet that follows any proper departure. It was the clergyman who broke it first. "Chipping Campden, is it, for you both?" he asked, after a polite interval had passed, his voice carrying the quiet eagerness of someone new enough to travel that conversation still felt like an adventure rather than an obligation. "Chipping Campden," Aldous confirmed. "Our first grandchild, a boy, born just 3 weeks past." The clergyman's face brightened considerably. A fine reason for a journey. I'm bound there myself. My first curacy, if all goes as arranged. I confess I've heard a great deal about the place and seen almost none of it firsthand. Is it truly as elegant as they say? Elegant, Prudence said softly, a small smile touching her mouth, and warmer than Oxford somehow, even in the coldest months, though that may simply be memory being generous. The clergyman nodded, satisfied, and turned to look out his own window as the last scattered houses of the city's edge gave way to open countryside, dark fields rolling away on either side beneath a sky just beginning to fill with stars. Somewhere behind them, faint and fading, the last church bell of Oxford sounded a final note, and then there was only the coach's own steady rhythm and the darkening world beyond the glass, and the long night's journey properly, finally begun. He asked, too, whether the roads were generally kind to travellers at this season, and Aldous assured him they were, barring the odd stretch of mud near the low ground, and the clergyman received this news with the relief of a young man who had heard a great many alarming stories about coach travel from well-meaning relations, and was glad, for now, to set them aside. Prudence asked him, in turn, whether he had left family behind in taking up his new post, and he admitted, with a small, rueful smile, that he had a mother and 2 sisters, all still in Oxford, all considerably less certain than he was that a country curacy represented any great improvement upon university life. With the city fully behind them now, the coach's own sounds began to rise up and fill the quiet the streets had left behind. The leather springs beneath the carriage flexed and sighed with each rut and rise in the road, a low, patient creaking that seemed to breathe in time with the horse's steady trot. The glass in the window frames rattled faintly in its casing, a small, persistent music that Prudence found, after a while, rather soothing than otherwise. Outside, the coach lamps swung gently on their brackets, throwing long, moving shadows across the roadside hedges as they passed, the light catching briefly on a fence post, a gate, a low stone wall, before sliding away into darkness again. Aldous watched this play of light and shadow with quiet fascination, the way a man watches a fire, needing no particular thought to justify the watching. Beneath the coach, the wheels found their own steady percussion against the road's uneven surface, a rhythm that changed subtly with every shift in the ground beneath them, softer where the road ran over packed earth, sharper and more insistent where loose stone had been laid to firm a low, wet stretch. The whole vehicle seemed, in these small variations, to be telling its own quiet story of the miles already passed. He allowed his hand to rest against the seat between them, close enough that Prudence's own hand, when she shifted slightly with the coach's motion, came to rest lightly atop his. Neither of them remarked on it. It seemed, in the gathering dark, the most natural thing in the world. A fox crossed the road ahead of them, unhurried, pausing only to glance once toward the approaching lamps before slipping into the hedgerow and vanishing wholly. The coachman, high above on his box, called something low to the horses, more habit than necessity, and the team settled back into their steady rhythm, as though nothing at all had interrupted it. Prudence's bonnet ribbon had come loose from its careful bow, and she retied it now without any real urgency, her fingers moving through the familiar motion while her attention remained fixed on the darkening world beyond the glass. The small, domestic task requiring no more of her mind than the coach's steady rocking aloud. Far off, the lights of some scattered farmhouse glimmered briefly through a gap in the hedgerow before the road's curve hid them again. One small, private household going about its own quiet evening, entirely separate from the travellers passing so near and so briefly beyond its walls. The road descended gently toward a river crossing, and the sound of water grew steadily louder before the bridge itself came into view. An old stone structure, humped in the middle, its parapets worn smooth by generations of hands trailing along them. The horses' hooves changed their note as they reached the bridge, the hollow ring of stone replacing the softer thud of packed earth, and the whole coach seemed to lift slightly as it crested the bridge's arch before descending on the other side. A heron rose from the reeds below, startled by the sudden noise, its wings beating slow and heavy against the darkening sky before it settled again further downstream and below. Unseen in the darkness but clearly heard, the river moved steadily over unseen stones, a low, constant murmur beneath the coach's own rhythm. There was a bridge very like this, Prudence said quietly, watching the dark water pass beneath them. On the road out of Chipping Campden, the night you first walked me home from the ballroom. Do you remember it? I remember every part of that walk, Aldous said, and said nothing further, though his hand pressed very slightly against hers. On the far bank, a fisherman's small boat lay overturned upon the grass, waiting out the night beside a coil of rope and a single abandoned oar, and Prudence found herself imagining, briefly and without any reason, the quiet mornings such a boat must know, long before any coach passed this way. A small stone plaque was set into the bridge's parapet, worn nearly smooth by weather and time, marking some date or benefactor long since forgotten by anyone still living. And Aldous found himself wondering, briefly, how many other such small monuments line this road, each one holding some story no traveller passing tonight would ever properly know. A light appeared ahead in the darkness, small and steady, and resolved itself gradually into a toll-gate keeper's cottage, a single window glowing amber against the night. The coach slowed, the horse's pace easing to a walk, and a stooped figure emerged from the cottage door with a lantern held aloft, moving to swing the gate wide before the coach had fully stopped. "Evening to you," the keeper called up to the coachman, his voice carrying the flat cheerfulness of a man long accustomed to strangers passing through his small patch of the night. A coin changed hands. A word or two was exchanged about the weather holding fair. The keeper's lantern swung as he moved, sending its light briefly across the cottage's low garden wall, where a scarecrow stood watch over rows of turned earth, its shape momentarily comic, and then, as the light passed on, simply another shadow among many. Through the window, Prudence caught a glimpse of the cottage's interior as they passed. A fire burning low, a cat curled before it, a woman's shape moving briefly across the light. A whole small life, contained and complete, glimpsed for a single breath, and then gone as the coach rolled on through the open gate and back into darkness. The keeper's dog, roused by the commotion, padded out to sniff once at the coach's wheels before losing interest fully and returning to its place beside the cottage door, curling itself down with the settled indifference of an animal that had seen 1,000 coaches pass and expected to see 1,000 more. A second traveller waited at the gate on foot, a peddler by the look of his pack, exchanging some brief word with the keeper before stepping aside to let the coach pass, touching his cap toward the lit windows as it rolled by, a small courtesy offered and received in the space of a single breath. The first proper stop came some 2 hours into the journey at a coaching inn called the Swan and Anchor, its windows glowing warm against the surrounding dark, smoke rising steadily from its chimneys into the cold night air. The yard here was smaller than the one they had left in Oxford, more intimate, lit by 2 lanterns rather than a dozen, but it moved with the same practiced efficiency. Fresh horses already being led out to replace the tired team, a boy running back and forth with buckets, the coachman climbing down to stretch his legs and exchange brief words with the innkeeper. Inside, the common room offered a fire large enough to warm the whole space, and a pot of something rich and savoury simmering over it that filled the air with the smell of onions and thyme. Aldous found them a table near the hearth, and Prudence sat with her hands extended toward the warmth, feeling the cold of the journey begin, slowly, to loosen its grip on her fingers. A pair of dogs lay stretched before the fire, unbothered by the arriving travellers, and above the mantel a row of pewter tankards caught the firelight in a soft, shifting gleam. Other travellers occupied the room's far corners, a merchant with his ledgers spread before him, 2 soldiers speaking low over their ale, each absorbed in their own small pocket of the evening, the whole room humming with the particular companionable quiet of strangers sharing warmth without any obligation toward conversation. 20 minutes only, the coachman announced to the room, and set about his own bowl of soup with the brisk efficiency of a man who had learned long ago never to waste a moment of rest. A fiddle rested in one corner, propped against the wall as though its owner had only just set it down, and Prudence found herself wondering briefly what tunes it had carried through this same room on other evenings for other travellers in years she would never know anything about. The coachman ate standing near the fire rather than at any table, his bowl balanced in one broad hand, exchanging brief, easy words with the innkeeper about a bridge repair somewhere further along the route. The shorthand conversation of men whose working lives overlapped at just such way stations, month after month, year after year. A second traveller, an older woman travelling alone, sat near the window with her own bowl of soup, offering the newly arrived party a small, courteous nod before returning her attention to the fire, content, it seemed, with her own quiet company on this evening. The innkeeper's wife, a round, kind-faced woman with flour still dusting one sleeve, brought their soup herself and lingered a moment at the table, the way innkeepers' wives often did with travellers who seemed, for whatever reason, worth a moment's extra attention. 40 years we've kept this house, she said, when Prudence asked, with evident pride rather than complaint. My husband's father before him, and his father before that. I sometimes think the walls know more of this road than we do. She glanced toward the fire, where her own husband stood turning a spit with the steady patience of a man who had done the same task 10,000 times and found, apparently, no reason yet to tire of it. 40 years, Aldous repeated, glancing at Prudence. "We've 32 ourselves, though a marriage is a different sort of inn, I suppose." The woman laughed, a warm, easy sound. "Not so different as you'd think, sir. Both require a body to keep the fire lit, even on the nights they'd rather not." She patted the table once, cheerfully, and moved off to another traveller's call, leaving them to their soup and the fire's steady warmth, and the particular comfort of having been, for a moment, truly seen by a stranger. A young serving girl passed with an armful of fresh linen, bound, presumably, for some room upstairs, where another traveller waited out the night in proper rest, and the innkeeper's wife called after her some small instruction about the airing of the sheets, her voice carrying the same brisk warmth she had shown the coach's own passengers only moments before. The soup, when it came to its end, left behind a good crust of bread for wiping the bowl clean, and Aldous did so without any embarrassment, the unpretentious pleasure of good simple food eaten properly, without ceremony, in the warm heart of a working inn. Beyond the Swan and Anchor, the road climbed onto open heathland, and a thin mist began to gather in the low places, drifting pale and slow across the dark ground like something with quiet intentions of its own. The coach lamps caught it in soft halos, and for a while the world beyond the glass seemed to consist of nothing but shifting grey and the occasional black silhouette of a gorse bush, hunched and solitary against the mist. The road here ran higher than it had, and the wind found its way more easily to the coach's windows, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of wet heather and turned earth. Somewhere out in the darkness a curlew called, its cry long and mournful and entirely undisturbed by anything so small as a passing coach. And then the heath fell quiet again, wrapped in its own patient watching. Inside, conversation had settled into a comfortable quiet. The young clergyman had drawn his coat closer and closed his eyes, not quite asleep but resting all the same. Prudence leaned her head lightly against the window frame, watching the mist without any certain need to name what she saw in it. Aldous watched her, rather than the view, the soft rise and fall of her breathing, the particular stillness that came over her only in moments of complete ease, and felt something in his own chest loosen to match it, the accumulated tension of the day's travel finally beginning to release its hold on him. A shepherd's hut stood dark and empty a little way off the road, its door hanging slightly ajar, and Aldous found himself wondering what manner of man spent his working life out here, alone with the sheep and the wind and the wide, indifferent sky, and whether such solitude might not carry its own quiet contentment. Prudence drew her shawl closer against a small draught, finding its way through the window's edge, and Aldous, noticing, reached to adjust the leather curtain strap without being asked, closing the gap by some small degree, a gesture so practiced after 32 years that neither of them thought to remark upon it. The mist thickened briefly as the road dipped into a shallow hollow, wrapping the coach's lamps in soft, close halos, before thinning again as the ground rose, releasing them back into the heath's wider, starlit dark. At the next brief halt, where the road split toward a smaller village, a new passenger joined them, an elegant woman of middle years, well wrapped against the cold, who settled into the seat beside the clergyman with an efficient rustle of skirts and a murmured apology for the intrusion. "Chipping Campden," she said, once introductions had been exchanged, in answer to Prudence's polite inquiry. "I've family there, wool merchants, as my husband's people always were. I confess I return gladly each year for the autumn fair. There's a baker near the market hall. You must try his seed cake if you've never had the pleasure, still warm from the oven of a morning, the caraway barely settled on top." "We haven't been in some years," Prudence admitted. The lady tilted her head slightly, curious but too well-mannered to press further. "Then you're due a fine surprise. The town changes so little, you understand. That's rather its particular charm. And yet, each time I return, I notice some small thing I'd wholly forgotten. Last year, it was the sundial above the old grammar school door. I must have walked past it 1,000 times as a girl and never once looked up. Oh, you'll find it much the same, I should think. And finer besides, once the harvest's in. The old wool church stands taller than anything else in the town, and the whole high street is built of that pale gold stone. They say it glows like honey when the evening sun strikes it just so." The lady settled back with evident satisfaction at having delivered this small gift of anticipation, and turned her attention to the darkened window. Already, it seemed, half returned to the town she was describing. She went on a while longer, describing the way the market square filled on fair mornings, stalls crowding in from every direction, the smell of roasting chestnuts mixing with wet wool and fresh bread, until even the young clergyman, who had never once set foot in the place, found himself smiling at the picture she painted so readily for them all. Prudence found herself warming to the woman's easy company, and the two of them fell into a comfortable exchange about small domestic matters, the best way to keep linens fresh on a long journey, a remedy for travel sickness the lady swore by, the quiet companionable talk that women of a certain age fell into easily, regardless of how briefly they had known each other. Aldous listened to this exchange with quiet pleasure, content to let the two women carry the conversation, and found himself, not for the first time that night, simply grateful for the easy company. A long coach journey seemed always, eventually, to produce among strangers willing to offer it. Somewhere past midnight, a new sound reached them above the coach's own steady rhythm. A low, rhythmic groaning, mechanical and patient, growing steadily louder as the road curved alongside a narrow stream. A mill appeared through the mist, its great wheel turning slowly in the dark water, catching what little light the coach lamps offered and scattering it into 100 small, momentary gleams. The stream itself ran shallow and swift beside the road for a stretch, its voice a constant low murmur beneath the mill wheel's steadier turning. And the air here carried a faint dampness, cool against the skin, mixed with the earthy smell of whetstone and turning mill race. A single window glowed in the mill house beside it, and through the coach window they glimpsed a figure moving within, tending to some late work by lamplight, entirely absorbed in whatever task kept him from his bed at such an hour. "Working through the night," Aldous murmured, watching the great wheel turn. "I wonder what keeps a man at his mill so late." "Perhaps he simply prefers the quiet of it," Prudence said. "Some work goes easier when the rest of the world has gone to sleep." The mill fell away behind them, its wheel still turning, its light still glowing, continuing its patient work long after the coach itself had rolled on into the dark. A stack of grain sacks stood piled near the mill's low door, and the smell of fresh ground flour drifted out to mingle with the damp night air, warm and faintly sweet against the surrounding cold. Prudence watched it all pass with the particular fondness of someone who had once, long ago, ground her own small handful of flour at just such a mill, in just such a sleepy hour, though the memory itself had grown too faint now to properly recall. The mill race ran alongside the road for a further quarter-mile before curving away toward its own destination, and the sound of it followed the coach a while longer, even after the mill itself had slipped from view. A low, patient murmur beneath the more insistent rhythm of hooves and wheels. A second window lit briefly on an upper floor of the mill house, then dimmed again almost at once, some small domestic errand completed and its candle carried away to another room, leaving the ground floor's steadier light to keep its lone vigil over the turning wheel. The road dipped down toward a wider river than the one they had crossed by the stone bridge, too wide here for any bridge at all, and the coach slowed to a careful walk as it approached a shallow ford, the horses picking their way with evident familiarity into the dark water. The wheels sent up a fine spray on either side, catching the lamplight in brief silver arcs, and the whole coach rocked gently with a new and different motion, less the steady jolt of the road and more a slow, deliberate sway, as though the vehicle itself had, for these few minutes, become something closer to a boat. The coachman called something low and steady to the horses, more comfort than instruction, and they answered with the calm, unhurried confidence of animals who had crossed this same ford more times than anyone troubled to count. Prudence gripped the window frame lightly, not from any real alarm, but from the simple pleasure of feeling the change, watching the dark water part around the wheels below. Within a few minutes, the horses found firmer ground on the far bank, and the coach settled back into its familiar rhythm, though something of the water's cool, mineral scent lingered in the air a while longer, mixing with the leather and the horses and the night itself. On the far bank, willows leaned low over the water, their bare branches trailing near the surface, and for a moment, as the coach climbed free of the ford, their shapes against the moonlit sky seemed almost to bow toward the travellers passing beneath them, a small, silent courtesy extended by the night itself. The clergyman, roused by the change in motion, glanced out with mild interest before settling back again, fully untroubled, the equanimity of a young man for whom river crossings by night still held more novelty than concern. The lady from Chipping Campden had fallen into a light doze, her head nodding gently with the coach's motion, and the young clergyman had given up any pretense of wakefulness entirely, his breathing slow and even in the seat opposite. Prudence, too, seemed close to sleep, her eyes half closed, though whether she truly slept or simply rested, Aldous could not have said with certainty. Outside, the moon had risen fully now, laying a thin silver light across the passing fields, and the coach's own lamps seemed, by comparison, small and yellow and wholly earthbound. In the quiet, his hand moved, almost without his own permission, to the inside pocket of his waistcoat, where a small folded square rested against his chest, worn soft now from 3 decades of occasional, private touching. He did not draw it out. He simply let his fingers rest against the shape of it through the fabric, the way one might touch a locket or a small stone carried for luck, and looked out at the dark countryside sliding past, and thought of a ballroom he had not properly pictured in years. Prudence, beside him, did not stir, though had he looked closely, he might have noticed that her own hand had drifted in that same quiet moment to rest against the clasp of her travelling case. Outside, a single star burned brighter than the rest, low near the horizon, and Aldous found his gaze drawn to it now and again through the long, quiet minutes, though he could not have said why, except that it seemed, in its steady patience, rather like a small companion to his own private thoughts. Somewhere beneath the coach, the road surface had grown smoother for a stretch, and the reduced jolting seemed, in the quiet, almost a kindness offered by the night itself, allowing the coach's remaining waking passenger a few minutes more perfect stillness in which to sit with his own private thoughts. A gentle shift in the coach's motion, the road finding a slightly steeper grade, caused Prudence to settle a fraction closer against him in her sleep, and Aldous adjusted his own position very slightly to better receive the weight of her, entirely willing to sit uncomfortable a while longer for her greater ease. Near 2 in the morning, the coach drew into a proper changing station, larger than the humble toll gate, but quieter than the inns they had stopped at earlier, its purpose purely practical rather than hospitable. Lanterns hung along the length of a low, stable building, and 2 ostlers moved between them with the brisk, wordless efficiency of men well practiced in their work, even at this unsociable hour. A night watchman sat on an upturned barrel near the door, a heavy coat wrapped close around him, a clay pipe resting unlit in one hand. He nodded once to the coachman as the tired team was led away and a fresh one brought forward, harnesses jingling softly in the cold air, the new horses stamping and testing their footing with the particular restless energy of animals just roused from rest. The stable smelled of warm hay and leather oil, and somewhere within it a groom hummed low and tuneless to himself as he worked, the small sound carrying out into the yard alongside the clink of buckles and the occasional soft word to settle a nervous horse. Frost had begun to gather on the yard's cobblestones, catching what light the lanterns offered in tiny, scattered points, and Aldous, glancing out, thought the whole scene looked rather like something a painter might have arranged on purpose for the pleasure of it. Inside the coach, no one stirred to disembark. This was not a stop for passengers, only for horses, and within a quarter hour the whistle sounded again, brief and businesslike, and the coach rolled forward once more into the deepening night, its new team finding their pace within the first few 100 yards. A second lantern hung near the well, and beside it a rough wooden bench where, presumably, travellers less fortunate than they waited out the colder hours between coaches. Prudence felt a small, private gratitude for the coach's steady progress, for not being one of those left waiting alone in such a place at such an hour. Aldous stepped down briefly to stretch his own stiffened legs, exchanging a nod with the night watchman, who offered nothing more than a companionable grunt in return, the wordless courtesy shared between men keeping their own separate vigils through the same long, quiet hour. The fresh team, once fully harnessed, stood remarkably still and calm despite the hour, their breath rising in pale clouds against the cold, and the head ostler ran one final, practiced hand along each length of harness before signalling to the coachman that all was properly in order. Prudence had, by now, truly fallen asleep, her head resting against Aldous' shoulder rather than the window frame, her breathing slow and untroubled. Aldous sat very still, unwilling to disturb her by so much as a shift of weight, and found himself, in the stillness, simply looking at her face in the dim coach light. 32 years had changed it, certainly. The softness of youth given way to something quieter, and, he thought, considerably finer. The lines at her eyes earned, rather than merely accumulated. But there was something in the particular angle of her sleeping face, something in the way a loose strand of hair curved against her cheek, that struck him, not for the first time on this journey, as fully unchanged from a girl he had watched across a crowded ballroom floor a lifetime ago. He did not wake her. He simply watched and let the coach carry them both onward through the dark, content to be, for this quiet hour, nothing more than a man keeping careful watch over something he loved. Outside, the moon had climbed higher still, silvering the tops of the passing hedgerows, and somewhere far off an owl called once, low and questioning, before falling silent again into the night's larger quiet. Her hand, resting loose in her lap, still bore the faint mark of her wedding ring, worn smooth with 3 decades of daily wear, and Aldous found his gaze returning to it more than once, struck, as he sometimes still was after all this time, by the quiet fact of it, that this hand, worn and familiar and entirely known to him, had once been a stranger's hand he had only dared to hope might someday rest in his own. The young clergyman shifted slightly in his own sleep, murmuring some fragment of a word before settling again, and Aldous glanced at him briefly before returning his full attention to Prudence, unwilling to spend even a moment of this quiet hour on anything but her. His mind, unbidden, returned to that ballroom now, the memory arriving not as a story he told himself, but as a series of small, vivid fragments, the way memory often worked upon a person late at night. The gold of the candlelight against the ballroom's high windows, the sound of a string quartet tuning before the first dance, a young woman in pale blue, laughing at something her companion had said, her head tipped slightly back, the smell of beeswax candles and crushed flowers underfoot, and beneath it all, the particular electric hush that fell over a room the moment the first notes properly began. He remembered crossing the floor towards her with a confidence he had not, in truth, wholly felt. He remembered asking her to dance and the small, appraising look she had given him before accepting, as though weighing whether he was worth the trouble. He remembered, most clearly of all, the moment near the dance's end when a ribbon had slipped loose from her hair and fallen, unnoticed by her, to the floor, and how he had retrieved it without quite deciding to, and had somehow, in the confusion of the evening's end, never returned it. He had told himself for years it was simple forgetfulness. He knew now, watching her sleep against his shoulder, that it had never been anything of the kind. He remembered, too, the colour of the punch bowl's reflected candlelight, and the way the older ladies had gathered near the windows to watch the dancing with an indulgence he had not, at the time, properly understood but recognized now Decades later, as the quiet tenderness reserved for watching young people fall unknowingly in love, he remembered too walking her home afterward beneath a sky not so very different from the one now passing beyond the coach window, and the particular nervousness of that walk. Every silence between them feeling, at the time, enormous with possibility, though neither of them had yet found the words to name what was happening. He remembered, finally, the quiet of the carriage ride home that first night, both of them still glowing faintly with the evening's warmth, neither quite bold enough yet to say aloud what each had already, privately, begun to suspect. The road descended toward a small village, its houses dark and shuttered against the night, only the faint outline of a church spire visible against the star-filled sky. A bell somewhere within the church tower sounded twice, marking some hour Aldous did not trouble to count, the notes carrying clear and solitary across the sleeping rooftops. A dog barked once, somewhere behind one of the darkened houses, a brief, unbothered sound, more habit than alarm, and then fell silent again. No lights showed in any window. No figure moved along the single street the coach passed through. A well stood at the village's small crossroads, its bucket still hanging from its rope, and beside it a horse trough caught a thin sliver of moonlight on its still water. The whole village lay wrapped in the deep stillness that belonged only to the hours between midnight and dawn, when even the most restless households finally fully slept. The coach passed through it in perhaps 2 minutes, its wheels loud against the village's cobbled street after so many miles of softer road, and then the houses fell away behind them, and the darkness of open countryside received them once more. A single candle burned in one upstairs window as they passed, small and steady, the only sign of wakefulness in the whole sleeping street, and Aldous wondered briefly what kept that particular household from rest. A sick child, perhaps, or simply a restless mind, before the windows slipped from view and the village released them back into open country. A weather vane atop the church tower turned slowly in the small night breeze, catching what little light there was in brief, irregular gleams, and then the road curved, and the village and its weather vane both slipped from view behind them. Their second proper stop came as the night reached its deepest, quietest hour at a smaller inn than the Swan and Anchor, its common room already banked down for the night, lit only by a single low fire and a scattering of candles the innkeeper brought out especially for the coach's arrival. Prudence woke as the coach halted, disoriented for a moment before memory returned, and allowed Aldous to help her down into the cold, clear night air. Inside, the innkeeper, roused from his own bed by the look of him, offered them warm milk rather than anything more substantial, apologizing for the lateness of the hour with the weary courtesy of a man long accustomed to travellers' odd schedules. The room was small and low-beamed, its single fire banked down to a bed of soft orange embers that gave more comfort than light, and the milk, when it came, was warmed with a little honey and nutmeg, the cup pleasantly hot against cold fingers. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked once, the innkeeper's family settling back into sleep, and the whole small building seemed to hold its breath around them, patient and undemanding, asking nothing of its late, unexpected guests beyond the simple comfort of warmth freely given. They sat close to the small fire, cups warming their hands, saying little, needing to say little. Outside, the horses were changed once more. Inside, the candlelight flickered gently against the low-beamed ceiling, and for a quarter-hour the whole world seemed to consist of nothing more than warmth and quiet and each other's company. A cat wound once around Prudence's ankles beneath the table, uninvited but not unwelcome, before curling itself into a loose grey knot near the fire's warmest edge. The innkeeper's daughter, roused along with her father, peered sleepily around the door frame before being sent gently back to bed, and the small domestic scene, glimpsed and gone, left both travellers smiling into their cups. The innkeeper, satisfied that his unexpected guests wanted nothing further, retreated to some back room with a murmured good night, leaving them alone with the fire's low glow and the certain privacy that belonged only to the smallest hours, when even hospitality itself seemed to soften into something gentler and less formal. A clock somewhere in the inn's back room struck the half-hour, its chime muffled by distance and old plaster, and Aldous found himself thinking, not for the first time that night, how strange and how pleasant it was to measure a journey not in miles, but in such small, scattered moments of warmth. Prudence woke as the coach's motion changed, the wheels finding a smoother stretch of road, and for a moment she sat blinking in the grey pre-dawn light filtering through the window, uncertain where the night had carried her. "Where are we?" she murmured, still half inside sleep, her hand finding Aldous' sleeve without quite meaning to. "Closer than you think," he said gently, his voice low so as not to wake the other passengers. "The Cotswolds by breakfast, if the roads hold fair. You've slept through the best part of the night, though I confess I didn't mind the company of your dreaming." She settled back against him, not yet ready to fully wake, and watched through half-closed eyes as the fields outside began, very slowly, to separate themselves from the darkness. A hedge here, a gate there, the first suggestion of shape returning to a world that had spent the last several hours as nothing more than shadow. A thin skein of mist lay across the lowest field, undisturbed as yet by any wind, and somewhere beyond it a cockerel crowed once, testing the morning before committing fully to it. A lark rose somewhere out over the fields, its song thin and clear against the strengthening light, and Prudence listened to it with the particular pleasure of someone still only half returned from sleep, the world around her not yet fully solid, still carrying something of the soft, easy quality of dreams. The young couple across from them still slept, the young wife's head resting against her husband's shoulder in an echo, though neither Aldous nor Prudence remarked upon it, of their own position not so many hours before. Aldous drew his own coat a little closer around her shoulders, a small, unnecessary kindness against a chill that had, in truth, already begun to lift, and Prudence let him do it without protest, accepting the gesture for the tenderness it carried rather than any practical need. At the next brief stop, 2 new passengers climbed aboard. A young couple, newly married by the look of their still careful formality with one another. Bound, they said, for their very first visit to relations they had never met. The young woman could not stop glancing out the window, her excitement bright and unguarded in a way that neither age nor habit had yet worn smooth, and her husband kept one hand resting protectively over hers, though whether to steady her nerves or his own, it was difficult to say. "Is it far still?" she asked. of no one in particular, and the young clergyman, roused now and cheerful, assured her it was not really, not once the sun properly rose. Prudence watched the two of them with a quiet, private smile, remembering, though she said nothing of it aloud, a similar journey of her own, decades past, when every mile had felt charged with the electricity of a life not yet fully begun. Aldous, watching her watch them, felt something of the same recognition pass through him, unspoken but entirely shared. The young husband caught Aldous's eye at one point and offered a small, rueful smile, the particular look of a man still adjusting to the weight and privilege of a new title, and Aldous returned it with a nod that carried, he hoped, some measure of the reassurance he himself might once have welcomed on such a night. The young wife asked Prudence, with the directness of youth, whether the journey grew easier with long marriage, and Prudence considered the question properly before answering that it did, though not perhaps in the way one expected, not by growing less remarkable, but by growing steadily more precious with every mile travelled together. The young husband, encouraged perhaps by his wife's easy conversation, asked Aldous what had first drawn him to Chipping, Campden, all those years ago, and Aldous considered the question a long moment before answering only that some places and some people simply made their claim upon a man before he properly understood what was happening. An elderly gentleman across the aisle, who had said little through the long night, cleared his throat and offered, unprompted, a small observation. "You'll know. You're near when the stone changes colour," he said. "Everything hereabouts is built from the same quarry near enough. That pale gold stone, warm as honey when the light catches it right. There's nothing quite like it anywhere else in England, to my mind. I've travelled a fair portion of the country in my time, and I've never once found its equal." "We're told the same," Aldous said, "though I confess I've near forgotten the quiet colour of it. It's been so long." "You'll remember the moment you see it," the gentleman said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had made this journey many times before, and returned his attention to the window as though he, too, were watching for that first gleam of gold against the waking sky. The old gentleman fell quiet again after this, content, it seemed, to have offered his small gift of anticipation and asked nothing further in return, and turned his attention back to the window, watching, like the rest of them now, for that first promised gleam of gold against the waking sky. The young wife, listening to this exchange with evident interest, asked whether the whole county shared this same golden stone, and the old gentleman confirmed it did, though he added that no two towns wore it quite the same, each one catching the colour a little differently depending on the particular slope of its streets and the certain angle of its morning sun. The sky beyond the window had shifted by slow and imperceptible degrees from the deep grey of true night to something paler, touched now at its eastern edge with the faintest suggestion of rose. A bird called once from a hedgerow as the coach passed, answered a moment later by another further off, and then a third, until the whole dim countryside seemed to be waking in scattered, overlapping voices. Dew lay heavy across the fields on either side, catching the strengthening light in 1,000 small cold gleams, and a low mist still clung to the hollows between the hills, though it too was beginning, slowly, to thin and lift beneath the sky's growing warmth. The air carried in through the window's small gap had turned crisp and clean, fully different from the close, sleepy warmth inside the coach, and Prudence breathed it in gladly, feeling the last traces of the night's tiredness begin to lift along with the mist itself. Prudence sat fully upright now, watching the light change with the attention of someone unwilling to miss a single stage of it. The coach lamps, still burning from the night, seemed now entirely unnecessary against the strengthening dawn, their flames pale and reduced beside the sky's own growing brightness. Aldous reached forward and extinguished the nearest one himself, a small, quiet gesture, and the interior of the coach filled instead with the soft grey-gold light of the breaking day, gentler by far than any lamp had managed through the long hours of darkness. A fox called once in the distance, sharp and strange against the gentler waking sounds around it, and then fell silent, leaving only the birds and the wind and the coach's own steady progress to fill the widening morning. The hedgerows, indistinct shapes only minutes before, resolved now into individual bramble and hawthorn, each leaf catching some small portion of the strengthening light, and Aldous found himself struck, as he sometimes was at such hours, by how much of the world's particular beauty depended wholly on simply being patient enough to watch it properly arrive. A pair of rabbits froze at the roadside as the coach approached, then bolted for the safety of the hedge, their white tails flashing once in the strengthening light before vanishing entirely into the deeper shadow beneath the branches. The road passed briefly through a small town, just stirring into its morning business. A baker's boy setting out trays in a shop window, a woman sweeping the step before her door, a farmer's cart already trundling toward what would presumably become, within the hour, a proper market square. A boy led a small flock of geese along the roadside, unhurried and fully indifferent to the passing coach, and somewhere a smith's hammer had already begun its steady, ringing work. The smell of fresh bread reached them even through the closed window, warm and yeasty, mingling for a moment with the coach's own familiar scent of leather and horse and old varnish. Prudence watched the town pass with quiet pleasure, this small glimpse of an ordinary morning beginning exactly as it must have begun 1,000 times before, entirely unaware of the two travellers watching it pass from their coach window. Then the last houses fell away, and open country received them once more, the road climbing gently now toward hills that had, until this moment, remained hidden beneath the night's dark cover. A church clock struck the hour somewhere behind them as they passed, its notes carrying clear and bright over the rooftops, counting out a morning that had, for this small town, only just properly begun. A cooper's sign creaked gently on its hinge above one shop front, and further along, a row of milk churns stood waiting outside a dairy door, their lids not yet removed, the whole street holding itself in that suspended moment before a day's business properly begins. A row of newly delivered milk churns stood gleaming outside the dairy, catching what little morning light had reached the street so far, and a boy balanced precariously atop a cart of firewood called some cheerful greeting to a friend across the way, his voice carrying clear and bright over the general quiet. It was Prudence who saw it first, a low ridge of hills rising ahead, and along their flank, catching the very first true light of the sun just cresting the horizon behind them, a scattering of rooftops and walls in a colour she had not seen in decades, but recognized instantly, wholly, as though no time had passed at all. "There," she said softly, and touched Aldous' arm. He leaned forward to follow her gaze, and saw it too, the pale gold stone the old gentleman had promised them, glowing now with the particular warm light of early morning, honey-coloured and unmistakable against the cooler greens and greys of the surrounding hills. A skylark rose somewhere from the fields beside the road, climbing and singing with the quiet joy of a creature entirely unaware of anything but the morning itself. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke further. It seemed, for that moment, that words might only diminish it. The young couple, roused by the sudden stillness in the coach, leaned toward their own window to see what had caught everyone's attention, and the young wife made a small sound of delight at the sight, her husband's hand finding hers without either of them quite noticing the gesture. The old gentleman, watching the colour spread across the distant hills, nodded once to himself with quiet satisfaction, as though some private wager with the morning had just been properly settled in his favour. The clergyman, fully awake now, leaned toward his own window as well, adding his own quiet murmur of appreciation to the coach's general hush. One more traveller, joining the small, shared reverence of that moment. The road descended toward the town proper, and the golden stone resolved itself gradually into particular shapes. A church tower, tall and solid, its bells not yet sounding at this early hour. A row of cottages along the roadside, their windows still dark. A market hall standing empty and waiting for the day's business to properly begin. Smoke rose thin and straight from a handful of early chimneys, the only sign yet that the town beneath its stillness had begun quietly to wake. Prudence sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, watching it all draw closer with an expression Aldous had not seen on her face in a very long time. Not quite joy, not quite sorrow, but something that seemed to hold a portion of both at once, the feeling that belongs only to returning after many years to a place that had once held the whole of one's future within it. The coach slowed as the road narrowed, the wheels finding the smoother stones of the town's own streets, and somewhere ahead, faintly, a cock crowed to greet the fully risen sun. A milkmaid crossed the street ahead of them, two pails balanced on a yoke across her shoulders, and glanced up briefly at the passing coach with mild, patient curiosity before continuing on her way, fully unaware that she had just crossed the path of two people at the very edge of the most important morning either had known in 32 years. Aldous found his own hand had come to rest over Prudence's without any conscious decision to place it there, and neither of them moved to separate, content simply to sit together in the deepening morning light, watching a town that had waited so long finally, properly arrive around them. A lamplighter, his work here nearly finished for the night, was extinguishing the last of the street's lamps as they passed, one by one, each small flame surrendering to the stronger, surer light, now spreading across the whole waking town. Aldous reached into his waistcoat pocket, his fingers finding the small folded shape that had rested there through the whole long night, and drew it out at last into the pale morning light, a ribbon, faded now, to the softest blue, worn thin at its edges from 3 decades of quiet, private keeping. He did not say anything. He simply held it, resting in his open palm, and looked at her. Prudence looked at the ribbon for a long moment, her breath catching very slightly, and then, without a word of her own, opened the clasp of her small traveling case and drew out a twist of paper, unfolding it to reveal the sprig of lavender within, its color faded to the palest violet gray, its scent still faintly, impossibly present after all these years. They looked at each other. Neither explained. Neither needed to. Something passed between them in the silence that no sentence could have carried half so well. And then, slowly, both of them smiled. The same smile, arriving in the same instant. And Aldous reached for her free hand and held it, the ribbon and the lavender resting together now in her lap, as the coach carried them the last quarter mile into the town where it had all first begun. The young clergyman, waking just enough to notice the two of them sitting so still and so close, seemed to sense, with the quiet tact of a young man well trained in matters requiring discretion, that whatever passed between them just then was not his to observe too closely, and turned his own gaze politely toward the window instead. Outside, the coach rolled on unhurried, entirely indifferent to the small, enormous thing that had just passed between its two eldest passengers, the horses maintaining their steady pace toward a town that had waited patiently for exactly this quarter hour. The coach drew to a halt in the yard of a small inn near the market square, the horses blowing and stamping with the particular satisfaction of a journey properly finished, the coachman climbing down to stretch limbs stiffened by a full night's driving. The morning was fully arrived now, the light clear and gold across the cobblestones, the air carrying the mingled scent of wood smoke and fresh bread, and, somewhere beneath it, the mineral coolness of stone that had stood in this same spot for centuries. A church bell began, at last, to sound the hour, its notes rolling out across the waking town in slow, calm succession. A cat picked its way along the inn's low wall, wholly unhurried by the arriving coach, and somewhere within the inn itself, a kettle had already begun its low, rising hiss, promising tea and breakfast to whoever cared to wait for it. The whole yard seemed to exhale, settling into the ordinary business of another day, entirely unaware that for two of its arriving travellers, this morning carried a weight 32 years in the making. Aldous climbed down first and turned to help Prudence from the coach, his hand steady beneath hers, and for a moment they simply stood together in the yard, travel-worn and stiff-limbed, and fully, quietly happy, looking at the town that had waited patiently for 32 years to receive them both again. Somewhere within the inn, a kettle's whistle rose and was quickly hushed, and a voice called cheerfully that breakfast would not be long. Prudence smoothed her skirts once, an old habit from 100 other arrivals, and found herself laughing softly at her own instinctive tidiness, here of all places, on this morning of all mornings. The young couple climbed down after them, thanking the coachman with evident relief at journey's end, and the young clergyman followed last of all, pausing to shake Aldous's hand warmly before setting off toward whatever lodging awaited his own new beginning in this golden town. The innkeeper, roused by the arriving coach, appeared at the door in his shirt sleeves, wiping his hands on his apron. offering the same slow welcome he had presumably offered 1,000 other travelers arriving at just such an hour, over just such a threshold, across however many years he had kept this particular house. They did not hurry. There seemed, after so long a journey, no reason left to hurry at all. They walked together along the quiet morning street, her hand resting in the crook of his arm, the golden stone glowing softly around them in the strengthening light, past shuttered shops just beginning to stir, past a baker's boy balancing a tray of warm loaves, past the tall church tower still ringing its slow, patient hour. The street curved gently, following some old, forgotten logic laid down long before either of them was born, and led them at last toward a small house set back from the road, its front garden just visible through a low iron gate. Somewhere ahead, a door opened. A voice, young, bright, still learning the shape of its own words, called out something neither of them quite caught, and in the garden, still holding the last of the season's color, the roses stood open to the morning light, waiting, as everything in this golden town seemed to wait, with infinite and unhurried patience for whoever might come walking up the path, the end. A baker's cart rattled past them, going the other way, its driver offering a cheerful nod, and somewhere close by, a kettle's whistle sounded through an open window, small and ordinary and entirely unremarkable, and yet, to two travelers, 32 years in the returning, it seemed the sweetest sound the morning had yet offered. Prudence paused once just before the final turn, and looked back the way they had come, the street, the coachyard now out of sight beyond it, the whole long night's journey folded now into memory, and then turned forward again, steady, toward whatever waited beyond the low iron gate. The iron gate gave a small, familiar creak as Aldous pushed it open, the sound of hinges long since worn into their own comfortable habit, and he held it for her, as he had held 100 other doors and gates across 32 years, and would, God willing, hold 100 more. And so the last mail coach rests quietly in its yard, its lamps extinguished, its long journey finished. If your eyes are already closed, that's exactly as it should be. There's nowhere else to be tonight. Nothing left to do but rest. If you enjoyed this quiet journey to the Cotswolds, there are many more evenings like this one waiting for you here. Other roads, other travelers, other gentle returns to the places that once held someone's whole heart. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and for letting us be part of your evening. Sleep well, wherever you are. We'll be here again tomorrow night with another quiet place to visit and another gentle story to carry you off to sleep. Good night. Wherever tonight's journey has carried you, we hope it leaves you exactly where you needed to be, warm, unhurried, and ready for sleep. The road will still be there tomorrow, and so will we, whenever you're ready to travel it again.